Hello again, this is Mark Mitchell, and today we're going to be looking for a few moments at chapter 3 in our textbook. Chapter 3 is about culture, and certainly an interesting one, but just wanted to point out some things that were of interest to me, and I'm sure there'll be some more as you're reading and completing your assignments. But as we start out with the chapter, it tells us where we're headed, and we're going to get a good idea of culture and some of the elements. And then we'll see some of the differences around the world and the diversity, and then end up with a changing world, culture, and globalization. Our other articles in the chapter that incorporate some of the things we're going to be learning are mentioned here. They're really kind of interesting too. I think the author has done a good job of putting some interesting articles in the book for us. We start out with a definition of culture, and you can see the two terms that are listed here, and I think it was a good idea to list them together. But culture, you can see the bottom term, all the things that are listed there, and maybe a shorter definition would be a way of life. That certainly does incorporate everything listed here. And then society usually has two things in it in that definition that we should pay attention to, and it is a group of people and then a specific territory in which they live. But these are two similar words in terms of what they refer to, and a lot of times people may use them interchangeably, and that's understandable about why they would do that, just from the definitions that we have here and how close they are. Our book also distinguishes between material and non-material culture. One which emphasizes things that have a tangible nature. So our book includes tools, toys, clothing, works of art, housing, money, food, other things like that. Non-material, it does not have a physical presence, a tangible aspect to it, but it's rather the beliefs that things have, the knowledge, standards, norms, values, all of those. And even though it doesn't have a tangible nature, it's not any less important. So culture is made up of both of these. And then our book calls it elements of culture, but I guess you could call it components too. And so, again, some of those are intangible with the beliefs, knowledge, norms, language, and more along the lines of that with symbols. But then it also has the objects that we mentioned on the previous slide as the material culture. All right, so good long list here. And then our book mentions in the elements of culture in that slide the idea of what makes something valuable, but that's our judgment, either positive or negatively. So the idea from this chapter is you can have different groups of people, different cultures, have different values upon things in their culture and outside of it. And a term that really applies to our society today is culture war. But here we have a disagreement of opinion over things that are very controversial. So it could be about same-sex relations, abortion, prayer in school, gun rights, sex education, immigration, or the role of religion in public life, or just a whole host of other things in which people take one side or the other and maybe can sometimes be very passionate about. We certainly see that all the time in the news today over some of these issues and even more. All right, but our book again gives us a list of some of the values that we see. Now this comes from Robin Williams, who found 15 basic values in really American life, and that's what we have here that goes along with the book around page 54 that we can see. Lots of interesting things that are listed in our book. All right. Now, I mentioned about Robin Williams, and this is actually not the list from him, but this is rather from Schwartz and some others. And the list here really is more of a global list. Now, when we go, I was thinking of Robin Williams, but when we think of him, some of the values, American values he listed were achievement and success, moral orientation, efficiency and practicality, progress, material comfort, democracy, but those were more or less American, and these are, I guess, global, or maybe like our chart suggests, widespread. Here's an interesting chart in our book, but it looks at, what countries believe in whose responsibility it is to assist the poor. And you can see from the title of the graph, particularly the rich, but this graph is very interesting. And if you look toward the end of the graph near the right hand side, the United States is kind of near the bottom. But that's the belief of people in this country who think the rich ought to assist the poor. So slightly over 50% is what our book indicates. And you can see other countries, it's much or considerably higher than that in some cases, but maybe up to not quite 2/3 of people in other countries, depending on where you are, believe that the rich should help the poor. All right, and so that is interesting, but it does show a cultural difference. And the real trend of the graph seems to be that the more wealthy you are, the less likely it is you think that the rich should help the poor, and the opposite is true as well. Got an interesting map here of the United States on the left, but it divides the nation into blue and red states in terms of political affiliation, red being Republican and conservative, and blue being Democratic and progressive. But really, probably the graph on the right is more representative. It's easy to paint a state as completely red or blue, but probably purple is more likely in most of the states. All right, we have, again, continuing the elements of culture, but we have the idea of beliefs. So, what people consider to be true. And, of course, there can be, as we've seen before, wide variation in what people do believe is true. So, for example, is democracy the best form of government? Should marriage be based on love or something else, maybe economics? What does it mean to be a success in life? Are all people created equal? Does God exist? Is violence justifiable if you're pursuing an important goal? Is it okay to use violence to get your goals accomplished? So those would be some beliefs that people could vary on. Again, got an interesting graph, but it's really showing the importance of religion and how it's related to income. And again, what we find is that those nations that seem to be wealthier, religion is less important, and nations in which income is lower, that religion seems to be more important. So a couple interesting graphs there about economic life and how that changes people's behaviors one way or the other on a couple different topics here in the chapter. Okay, we do again continuing the same topic, but we have the idea of knowledge, and then a new term there is culture shock, and it's maybe if you've done a lot of traveling, you maybe have encountered a group of people that have done something that you were not familiar with, and it's just the astonishment at that, and it's an unfamiliarity with a way of life. I remember reading, for example, in Alaska, the United States, it's considered good manners to offer your wife for sexual relations to an overnight male guest. And so that certainly would be culture shock to me if I were traveling. I really haven't done a lot of that, but that may also be shocking to others as well. All right, but again, some of the definitions here when it comes to norms, the rules for what is expected in a place. We have a couple other definitions on the screen. For example, cultural lag is maybe your technology outpaces your ability to deal with it. So, for example, if something happened to you, would you want to be kept alive artificially without real quality of life, or let your body die when your mind is gone? So that may be some good examples there of culture lag. Or would you want to clone yourself in order to have spare body parts in case you needed a new organ of some kind? Mores and folkways are some of these rules of life. The folkways are of really minor consideration. Mores are significant. And when you break them, for example, what are the repercussions? Well, it just depends if it's a severe norm or rule or not. And then taboo indicates, for example, where there's maybe a behavior such as cannibalism or having sexual relations with people who are in your family that you're not supposed to do. And then, for example, some of the penalties that might result if you break some of these rules of life. Our book mentions about a symbol, so that's anything that is recognized and it carries meaning to someone else. So, for example, young children are really excited when they see golden M's because it reminds them of McDonald's, where they can get some good food, ice cream and toys, and maybe can play in the restaurant or outside of it, depending on where all that equipment is. When we talk about language, it is a collection of symbols. That is how we actually produce a language, and there's so many languages around the world that humans are capable of learning. And then, of course, the dialect is also listed to remind us, just of the differences in accent or vocabulary or understanding of grammar and its rules. A quick example of that is in the United States, we call a carryable light a flashlight. I'm sure you have one of those, but in England they don't call it a flashlight; they call it a torch. So that is an interesting difference. The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis just says that because languages are structured in a certain way, they help to influence how we think, and the cultural content of a language also helps to structure kind of how we think about things. So one of the things I remember that kind of deals with this idea is I remember watching the movie Forrest Gump, but there they went to Vietnam, and because rain was something that happens quite a bit in Vietnam, they had all these ways to describe, the different types of rain, much like, an area, say, where had a lot of snow. But, around where we live, that's not something, the snow at least, is not something we experience very often, and so we have very few words to describe it as compared to, a culture or place where snow is a normal, almost everyday thing. All right, and our book does give us a short article there of different symbols around page 60, but some of those are familiar, I'm sure, to us. Some may be more recognized than others, but might be surprised at some of those symbols and how they were used before, maybe some of the connotations that we have recognized them more often with. All right, so as we move along here, our book goes along with ideal and real culture. So ideal is what you would like it to be, what it is expected to be. So, for example, in the United States, when you get married, ideal culture is that you're faithful unto death to that one partner that you have married. But real culture is that more than 50% of people get divorced for all kinds of reasons, but they don't live up to that ideal that they're faithful to their one spouse. And of course, you can think of many other things that are out there. For example, you're supposed to be kind to others, but real culture is not what we see. That's not what we see in a lot of the cases. Sometimes it is, and sometimes it's not. Ideologies are just a system that people have, and it helps them to understand the world, what's going on around them, and to also make judgments about the world and what's happening. And usually there is a dominant ideology in which, for example, that is used first, and it really serves the interest of those in power more often than those who are not. So, for example, you would not want to interrupt any type of business in our society today, and if you did, you would be asked to stop, or it could escalate to the police would come out and make you stop by either taking you to jail or just getting you out of the way of that business so things can operate normally. I know one of the rules here where I live is rather kind of silly, but it just showed the dominant ideology. But the rule is that you can't have furniture out on your front porch. So, for example, if you wanted to put a couch on your front porch, you couldn't. And what was interesting is the city only enforced this in wealthy areas of town, and they didn't do it in poor areas of town. So it definitely was an ideology there that some people who had spent a lot of money for their housing, they just thought that was unattractive and it would lower their real estate values, when in reality it didn't. But it was interesting how that was only enforced in only certain parts of the town where I live. Now, our book also mentions a few other terms that relating to cultural diversity, but the dominant culture, we've talked about that, and also in terms of the dominant ideology. And so for a lot of America's history, the dominant culture there was usually influenced by a lot of white people, because that was the majority makeup for the longest time. And that's in flux now. That'll be changing to where it's not going to be like that in the future. Subcultures just represent different interests that people may have. So, for example, people who like sports or who like dancing, all kinds of things like that, maybe their hobbies or interests, those are subcultures. It's certainly nothing negative. It's just a positive thing of showing the interest that people have. The counterculture is something that's negative, and these are people that are really unhappy with mainstream culture. And so what they might want to do is change the culture more to their liking, whether it's through legal means or other means, they would do that. So some groups that would be considered, a counterculture would be the KKK or the Black Panthers or some other group. Maybe we could even say at one time, maybe people who wanted communism. Maybe that would be considered a counterculture in the United States, or at least maybe definitely in the past. All right, our book mentions to us high culture and pop culture. I think neither one is right or wrong. It's just what people prefer. So I think I'm more into pop culture than anything else, and that just really is identified by really common things that people like to use. So, for example, TV programs that most people are familiar with, movies that most people are familiar with, rock concerts, comic books, sports, amusement parks, just kind of most things in life that are available to people that they use and enjoy. High culture, rather, is things that distinguish the elites of a society or a culture. So, whether it's their food or their transportation, their cars or other things, it really is kind of high class. So, maybe instead of a movie theater, it's an opera house or something like that. Instead of, a common brand of water that's really cheap, it's bottled water that's very expensive. So that would be how you could distinguish between the two. Multiculturalism is an effort to treat many cultures really the same way and not to exclude anyone. It's valuing everybody from everywhere, and that's been tried around the world for some time now. There's people who think that it works, and there's others who think that it doesn't work. So there's different advantages and disadvantages to that depending on which way you want to look at it. And of course, the United States, one of its promises was really to be a place that was considered multicultural, that doesn't favor one group over the other, and that's a good place for debate about whether that really has happened or not. A few other terms there. Ethnocentrism is when you make judgments about a culture based on your own cultural experience, and so we tend to do that, but you don't want to be discriminatory when you do it. To me, it's always seemed to just reflect your preferences, but others would take it a step further and say that it's just not fair to judge someone else by what you consider to be the norm. Cultural relativism is maybe a correction of that, but there's also some times when we can't go that far either, but it would argue that we try to understand another culture by that culture and what that culture says is proper or not, and not our culture. All right, and xenophobia is the idea that, hey, it's kind of like a fear of the unknown. So someone might be a little bit hesitant to try things a different way because of their own set preferences and likes and dislikes. Our book mentions a section there of cultural activism, and so it's just really people with concerns that they have and about what happens in different places and how people live. And then there's really three ways that you can participate in that. The Cultural Pride Organization is just really making people aware of a particular way that a group of people may live. So, maybe there's a parade that someone participates in, and it's based on a different group of people that just makes others aware of kind of what they do. Religious fundamentalism would be the same thing, except, for example, people are trying to get across, what they believe religiously and how they go about that. Our book, for example, mentions some of these activities on page 70 and 71. So you can see a lot of people who maybe are politically active. If they're marching at a different rally, say against abortion or some other thing, but you can see how maybe their religious views influence their behavior and why they're there. All right, and then anti-corporate activism. Our book has a picture of a young lady who looks like she's running. She's barefoot. But at any rate, it's showing how people in different countries work for Nike. They get low wages, but Nike sells these shoes for a great profit, and they pay their laborers, just pennies on the dollar. And so the point is there that some corporations take advantage of their workers and people, and that ought not to occur. So, nothing against Nike, but there's lots of other corporations you could say the same thing about. The last few slides just give us some pointers to take away. So, for example, technologies there utilized by poor countries, give them a voice that maybe they haven't had in the past. Think about all the symbols that you see every day and all the things that you normally do. Our book mentions, for example, around the South, the Confederate flag, and that's certainly been of controversy in the last year or so on whether these statues should be removed from public arenas. But, what is the actual history behind the Confederate flag? Is there something else about it that we ought to consider? That just shows how many of these things have been around for a long time and maybe have a meaning different than what we originally thought. And then here just mentions maybe about communicating in a place under extreme circumstances or an emergency like a doctor's office or emergency room. Did you ever have kind of trouble there in getting across what you meant to someone else? So that's an interesting phenomenon. I can say that's happened to me before. And then finally there, just one about the business that we talked about. So you can look at that and for yourself. And then finally, the review of the chapter. One thing we definitely see about culture is the different diversity that's going around. And of course, more of that is expected in the future because the world's just going to become a much more diverse place than ever before. All right. Well, I hope you are doing well. Hope this helps. And if I can be of further assistance, please let me know. Thank you.
I'll be back.